Hello and welcome to everyone participating and watching today. Thank you for joining us to launch the ITF's Transport Outlook 2021. During this session, we will hear the key takeaways from the Outlook as a whole. And then there are targeted sessions following this one this afternoon that will look more closely at urban and non-urban passenger transport and at freight. Over the course of these sessions, we will hear from chapter authors, ITF modelers, and invited guest speakers. But in this session, Malithi Fernando, the Outlook's project manager, will present the top findings of the report. We will then be joined by ITF's lead modeler, Luis Martinez, who will join us for a Q&A session following the presentation. And throughout this session, I would encourage those of you participating through the conference platform to please use the Q&A function that you will see to the right of your screen to submit any questions for our discussants during the session. You will also see a discussion box, and this is for you to communicate between participants in the platform, although I would please ask you to note that the discussion box will not be monitored or moderated by ITF staff during the session. So again, if there is a point that you would like to raise with us for discussion, I would ask you to use the Q&A function. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the live support button in the top right-hand corner of your screen to get assistance from the technical team. And with that, I will now ask Jari Kappala, the head of the Quantitative Policy Analysis team, to get proceedings underway. Jari.
Thank you, Ola, and good afternoon, everybody from Paris. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this session, this afternoon session, as part of the full day dedicated to the ITF Transport Outlook 2021, which was launched just yesterday at the press conference. We will have presentations and panel discussions over the day, and today specifically presentations around the key findings from the Outlook. The ITF Transport Outlook presents long-term projections for transport demand and related CO2 emissions under alternative policy scenarios. These scenarios are based on our in-house models, transport models covering all modes of transport, both freight and passenger, at the global level, at the national level, and at the level of even each city in the world. For us at the ITF, Outlook is really a strategic tool. It helps us to analyze how world could change if we choose different policies and different development paths. Today, more than ever, there is need for such analysis. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected our daily lives and challenge the way we work, travel, and live. At the same time, pandemic has highlighted the critical role the transport sector plays to ensure functioning of our societies. Now recovery has started, but how the pandemic will change the mobility of people and the transport of goods over the longer term is still very much uncertain. This edition of Outlook has a specific focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on transport, also on the longer term, providing some answers to that question. But at the same time, we must not lose sight of our vision for transport's future: economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable transport. As the results show from our Outlook, and which you will see very soon, the current decarbonization policies are not ambitious enough to meet climate goals set in the Paris Agreement. However, more ambitious decarbonization policies, together with well-targeted economic stimulus packages, would bring the climate goals of the Paris Agreement within reach faster and with more certainty. So there is an opportunity to really reshape the transport sector by aligning policies to revive the economy, combat climate change, and at the same time strengthen social cohesion of our societies, as illustrated by the new Outlook. The Policy scenarios that we present in this report are designed to explore possible futures based on a number of assumptions. And given the uncertainties and complexities of these assumptions, these scenarios should not be seen as forecasts for the next 30 years. For us, they are rather simulations to understand what role public policy can play in designing the future transport system. So we at the ITF consider the ITF Transport Outlook as a discussion starter. But at the same time, now more than ever, it is a call for action to reshape mobility in the wake of COVID-19. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor to my colleague Malithi Fernando, who has managed the preparations of this year's Outlook. She will give an overview of the findings of the new edition of the Outlook, but I hope you will also enjoy the rest of the sessions with our Outlook authors and the whole team and invited guests. And also, I wish that you participate actively in the debate through the question and answer function. Thank you very much, and Malithi, over to you.
Thank you, Jari. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Malithi Fernando. I co-authored and managed this 2021 edition of the Transport Outlook. My presentation today is a bird's eye view of the entire transport sector and where it might be headed. I'll cover main findings, recommendations, and it'll draw largely from the first and second chapters of the publication. So if you would like more details, please take a look there. First off, let's start off with a quick summary of the policy scenarios that Jari mentioned. We look at 3 different policy scenarios that represent 3 levels of ambition when it comes to decarbonizing transport. The first, recover, looks at a return to our current policy trajectory. It tracks where we might be in about 30 years if governments follow through on all the implemented and announced commitments from prior to the pandemic. Reshape offers a completely different trajectory. The commitments coming out of the pandemic are transformational. There's a focus on green recovery, and they go far beyond these original commitments of recover. In Reshape Plus, we identify where travel behavior and stimulus could be leveraged after the pandemic to boost certain policies under the Reshape scenario. These could be front-loaded so that they're implemented during the recovery period. What I mean by leveraging travel behavior is encouraging trends that we saw during the pandemic, such as increased walking and cycling, or choosing to teleconference instead of business travel. The first part of this presentation will take a look at where the transport sector is headed in terms of demand for travel and the resulting emissions. These are the results from our recover scenario. And then we'll take a look at policy recommendations to come out of our results. Starting off with demand, under our current level of policy ambition, we expect the demand for passenger travel and the movement of goods to more than double between 2015 and 2050. We all know that there was a dip in 2020, but this dip was temporary. We're already starting to see some pre-pandemic traffic levels in certain areas. Much of this growth in both passenger and freight transport demand is driven by population growth and increasing prosperity. This is compounded to a certain extent because the regions experiencing the highest levels of population growth are also the regions of rapid economic growth. So what does this mean for greenhouse gas emissions? Well, measured as the equivalent CO2 emissions, we estimate that the transport sector will see a 16% increase in CO2 emissions by 2050. This would overshoot the level needed to have a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by about 3 times. And of course, when we're looking at global warming, the total emissions are what matters. But when it comes to identifying where the responsibility may lie in generating the emissions and now leading the charge to decarbonize the sector, We see a strong correlation between world regions that generate the highest GDP per capita and where individuals emit the most transport emissions. The good news here is that these are also the world regions with the capital and the technological means available to them to take a leading role in reducing emissions. Now, how do we move from this fairly grim picture of where we might be headed, where we are headed, to what is possible with strong commitments and, even more importantly, action? How do you create a transport system that is more sustainable and more equitable? Well, we have 6 insights for policymakers to reshape our transport systems in this very unique time in history. First off, we need to raise ambition to reverse CO2 emission growth. This graph shows very clearly that even if we stick to our current efforts, that dark blue line, it is not enough to hit the CO2 reductions needed by 2030 and 2050, which would be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. As countries this year are revising their commitments to the Paris Agreement, there's a chance to do things differently. Under the reshape type policy scenario, we have a chance of just about meeting these carbon targets. But reshape plus, shown by the green line, which seeks to front load and further leverage opportunities during recovery from the pandemic, it offers a chance to meet these objectives sooner and with greater certainty. It achieves an emission reduction of 70% by 2050. These environmental ambitions need to be aligned with COVID-19 recovery policies to ensure that our economy recovers on one hand, but that these policies also day to day. The causes and consequences of climate change are also unequally distributed. Wealthier countries and individuals have had a historically higher carbon footprint, while the people suffering the consequences of climate change are very low emitters. Inequalities extend to transport access as well, which has a huge impact on people's well-being. Those that are well off have higher transport access and therefore access to greater opportunities in life. While vulnerable groups in developing and developed regions may be limited in the jobs that they can access, they may not have access to healthy food or healthcare. They may experience isolation, all because of these poor transport systems. COVID-19 has exacerbated many of these inequalities. It's exacerbated economic losses, especially for those in precarious jobs. And those that rely on public transport stand to lose one of the only forms of transport available to them if public transport is not prioritized as we emerge from this crisis. So what's the solution? Aligned action. And our results in this transport outlook are a contribution to this. Number 1, we look at the environmental aspect, of course, decarbonization. But beyond that, we look at measures that also help create jobs, improve the economic efficiency of cities, and connect people to these jobs. From a social perspective, many focus on improving access for groups like children, older people, women, people with mobility restrictions, whose travel needs have been poorly catered to in our existing systems. We also highlight where some decarbonization measures, especially those involving pricing, need to be considered with an understanding of the local context and exactly who will be affected, how, and to what extent, to ensure that they are implemented fairly and therefore effectively. One of the most important ways to align these goals is to move from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. Now, what do we mean by this? Accessibility-focused policies ensure that people have access to opportunities and goods without putting the focus on traveling more and traveling faster. It's good for people, it's good for the environment, and it makes good economic sense. These are policies to encourage denser neighborhoods where you can work, send your kids to school, shop, meet friends. And when you need to go elsewhere in your region or your city, you can easily access a transport hub where you can use public transport or shared mobility if that's more relevant, using a variety of other sustainable modes to access this hub, ideally walking, cycling, micromobility. Some of us may have gotten a glimpse of this during the pandemic as we walked and cycled more, and our trips stayed closer to home. Wouldn't it be convenient if all of our errands were also easier to complete close by? This is very different to the mobility-focused, private car-centric model that has been used traditionally in transport planning. It leads to building more and wider roads and inducing more and more car traffic. These principles also apply to freight, moving from long supply chains and faster transport to consolidation of loads, shorter supply chains that are also more resilient. These accessibility-focused policies help to reduce demand, but to a different extent based on sector. We see here the difference between demand in 2050 for each sector under the current trajectory and our most ambitious scenario. In cities, accessibility-focused policies have a significant impact in lowering demand. People altogether travel about 22% less. Freight as well achieves an 18% reduction in activity through shortened supply chains, asset sharing, and consolidation of loads, for example. In regional and intercity travel, demand reduction is more difficult. There are lower volumes of people traveling over longer distances, which means alternatives are harder to come by. This is especially true for regional travel, what we call regional travel. This is between rural areas and between rural areas and cities. Much of the demand reduction we see overall for this sector is due to a reduction in air travel between cities in the most ambitious scenario. So it is important to realize that the types of measures that we apply to different sectors will need to depend on their unique characteristics. Regional differences will also come into play. My colleagues will be going into these more sector-specific details in the following sessions. But for now, travel outside of cities, where possible, need to be shifted to cleaner modes, such as rail. But globally speaking, the largest benefits in terms of specifically CO2 reduction come from cleaner technology. This applies to all motorized modes, trucks, buses, cars alike. However, we don't yet have the ability to shift completely away from fossil fuel-based technologies. We do need more development to decarbonize the sector. We need to invest in developing new fuels and vehicles that are affordable and available quickly. We need to encourage their adoption by providing financial incentives and investing in public charging infrastructure. It is crucial that we target shared and high-use vehicle fleets, such as delivery vehicles, buses, shared mobility, with these new technologies, so that we can reap the most benefit compared to simply changing private cars. Lastly, improvements don't need to be in vehicles and fuels alone. We can already optimize operations through data sharing and digitalization, so that, for example, by having access to real-time information, we can choose the most efficient routes. This has immense benefits not only for passenger travel, but for freight as well. Last of all, in order to achieve any of the policy strategies that we have talked about, we need to seek out greater collaboration outside of the transport sector and even within its sometimes more disparate parts. Moving to clean transport means relying on alternative energy sources. So if you have an electric bus fleet, you're not going to be truly zero emission unless the electricity grid is also based on renewable energy. Sectors such as trade and tourism are deeply connected to the transport industry. During the pandemic, we saw very clearly what an important economic role tourism plays. To ensure the long-term sustainability of this industry, sustainable transport will be central. Private and public sector collaboration is becoming increasingly important as new mobility services are introduced primarily from the private sector. We must boost their social and environmental benefits, but keep the social and environmental costs in check, which requires closer relationships with public authorities. And bringing us back to the point on accessibility, land use and transport planning must be integrated to achieve greater access to opportunities without forcing people to travel more. In closing, of the 6 policy takeaways that we have discussed, at the very least, the 4 to walk away with today. Number 1, we need to increase ambition. We are not headed in the right direction with our existing policies. We need to align economic recovery with these decarbonization initiatives and those to create more equitable transport systems. We can achieve this by focusing on improving access to opportunities and not more travel. But beyond that, we will need to rely on further technological development to move away from fossil fuel dependency. The longer we wait to make these changes, the harder and more drastic they will need to be to limit global warming. We are at a very unique time in history. As we recover from this global crisis, and as countries are revising their commitments to the Paris Agreement targets, the transport outlook shows that we have a chance, if we act now, to reshape transport for a cleaner environment and fairer societies. Thank you very much for your attention during my presentation. I look forward to hearing from you during our question period. And now I'll hand the floor back to Orla.
Thank you very much for that, Melithi. And we are now joined on screen by Luis Martinez, our lead modeler for the Outlook. Luis, thank you for joining us. You're very welcome. Let's start with a question on the pandemic, because it is the very obvious theme running through our discussions today. We talk about, building on what has been observed, the changes that have been observed during the pandemic. But if I may be slightly contrary, is there also a note of caution that we should be sounding? Melithi, perhaps you could comment, are there any sustainable initiatives that are in fact at risk after what we have seen during the pandemic?
Thank you, Orla. It is a contrary opinion, perhaps, but it's also a very realistic one. We do really identify the risks and opportunities of this pandemic recovery period in the outlook. And if you will, there are equal numbers on both sides. Depending on how we act, whether economic stimulus goes towards new, cleaner energy sources, new, cleaner transport initiatives, or whether it seeks to shore up the existing economic practices that have maybe landed us where we are in the first place. It will definitely swing us in either direction. If we want to choose to have an inflection point in our trajectory, not just with respect to CO2 emissions, but also with respect to inequality, access to transport, access to opportunities, social health, safety benefits, etc. If we want to have an inflection point, we're going to have to do things differently. So I think some of the risks that we have identified in the report are a choice to put investment in activities that will hinder or at least not support sustainable transport initiatives. Public transport has been identified as a major, has had a major impact on it. The pandemic has had a major impact on transport. And if we do not radically shift the way we look at public transport, the way we finance it, there is a risk that it could lead to the collapse of the backbone of a sustainable transport system. In the freight sector, there's also the growth of e-commerce, which, if it is an uncontrolled growth without additional measures used to make sure that we don't have growth in congestion as a result of these urban logistics trips, there's a chance there that we run the risk of essentially shooting ourselves in the foot for solving these issues down the line. So those are just a few of the risks. Of course, we could keep going, but I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, that's certainly a comprehensive information on what else there is to consider as we move forward from the pandemic. So you mentioned both in your presentation and in your response there about economics. Basically, we're talking about the fact that the emerging economies are seeing growing their economies are growing. Apologies. Louise, perhaps you could comment, what sort of incentives exist for these countries to, in fact, leapfrog other countries in their approach to decarbonisation, rather than potentially trying to map out a path of following what others have done?
Thank you, Ola, for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to also to reply to some of the comments and questions. I would like to start to say that is also, as Maliti mentioned here, as with like with COVID, here's an opportunity, but also a challenge for developing countries, where because they are faced in a position where they may need to face investments or do it differently, as we did in the past to arrive in the position that we are now. And some of the decisions are targeted on land use and transport interactions, especially in urban places where better planning, especially in very fast growth cities, are quite required. And if we still have in these locations also predicted provide, we will also rely in the place where car will be needed, and car is also creating problems in the future, but also it will reinforce the need of local populations to rely on vehicles on the future, and it will keep this problematic cycle into the long term. And there is an opportunity there that we front load the measures that are also less investing intensive, like improving the efficiency of transport supply, have a better use of the resources that they are available at urban spaces, and also bring shared mobility, which currently in developing countries a lot of times is in the informal format, to bring this to a more formal format and interact with better information and data with public transport to provide a support to and access to population, especially in the lower income areas of the urban areas. There's a lot of opportunities, but a challenge, especially in developing countries, due to the constraints that will be financial on the ability to invest, and also for companies that are sometimes very small to have resources to upgrade or update their fleets, and in this very specific context. And this is one challenge, and I think is one challenge that we have to face in the next few years to not reduce the speed of convergence.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And you mentioned specifics there, so I'm just going to as an analyst and taking the modeling point of view, from the Outlook models, what sort of specifics in terms of the breakdown by region are we able to offer policymakers on the pace of CO2 reduction?
Thank you for that question, because we even posted also today in the OECD Stats Library our data sets on all the details of the model results for the different scenarios that Maliti presented for different models and for the different regions of the world. Then we want to be transparent in the assumptions, but also in the results that we are using in our analysis that Maliti described. And what we can see is that different pathways of convergence that we'll see after in detail for each chapter. But I'll just say in advance that what we start up in a different position, especially in developing countries and developed, where urban areas are already consolidated, and we are already facing a decrease on passenger kilometer intensity per inhabitant, than already transiting into more micromobility or non-motorized transport. The share of urban private mobility has already halted or already started decreasing, and we don't see this in developing countries. Then there is a challenge, especially also because the public transport provision is still not there, and there is also a need for investment. Then to have a way of providing this access, as we decided, then this is the challenge for developing countries, having the public transport with quality enough to allow citizens to not get the same pathway that we did in developing countries in the last 20 years. And as you mentioned before, leapfrogging and not having the same solutions that we had in the past. But also they need also information and also evidence-based analysis as we provide, also to try to help a little bit on how to take decisions and policies that would be more effective for citizens.
Excellent. Thank you, Luis. And Malithi, if I could maybe come back to you here, sort of segue across to a point that was made during the plenary session on the need for user-centered planning. So we hear a lot about the improvements due to technology and that, but could you say a little bit more maybe for policymakers on policies about that are focused on the user and accessibility?
Sure. It's true. We definitely need to focus any sort of plans, concrete interventions around the needs of the user. Our work here is quite high level, but when it comes to actually implementing these on the ground, it's very important that individual neighborhoods or cities or whatever scale you're looking at, we understand exactly what the concerns and what the key key areas for improvement are. So I fully echo and support the point that was made during that plenary session. I think it's very important also to realize that in a lot of what we are suggesting, it might seem that there's a strong emphasis on technological improvements and digitalization. And while we do talk about this, especially from a operations point of view, to make sure that you are routing your passenger or freight vehicles in an efficient manner, using data to understand the different user groups. When it comes to the actual user accessing transport, we do need to be aware that there is still a digital divide. Many areas of the world, you simply can't use a smartphone to access your shared mobility app, for example. And so these are considerations that we do need to keep in mind still. And to add to that point on data, we do need more disaggregated data in terms so that we can understand how different users are using transport systems, where there are shortcomings, who is not being served. And so more disaggregated data available at a wider scale would allow us to both plan for and monitor the success of certain interventions. So that's what I would say.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And I think possibly some of our audience weren't here this morning, and it was a question that has recurred in several conversations, is the role of those behavioral changes. So the changes that we've observed, such as teleworking over the last year, what sort of impact are we looking at them having in the longer term or the medium to longer term in the outlook models? And you're both nodding. So Luis, if you would like to start, and then Malithi, perhaps I'll come to you for some policy comments, please. Luis, from the model perspective,
Sure.
How are we accounting for these behavioral changes?
Thank you, Orla, for the question. We are accounting especially of a reduction of traveling, especially of the commuting share of trips that we are estimating for each region within the city. But we have a special element for the case of 2020, where the teleworking was not replaced for other types of activity, or they are done in a very short distance within your neighborhood. Then we have not currently a special case of teleworking that we didn't observe in the literature. And if we go to the literature, what we see is in the past, teleworking was very efficient to reducing peak traveling. But not reducing traveled kilometers. Then what we see is that this travel to work has been already replaced in parts in the literature or in the past to do other errands or activities that the household may do it out of the peak, but sometimes even relying more on private car than in public transport, because you use normally public transport more to commuting. Then there is an opportunity here to change or to be used to more teleworking and to have a different lifestyle within your household that would change this drastically. Also to do teleworking not even within your house, but sometimes in your neighborhood areas that would allow us for you to be more convenient locations and more professional landscape that sometimes within a house this is not available. And I think there are some positive elements of this, and we have just to control that the negative elements that we have observed in the past from teleworking, they don't come in the next few years. And the same thing for the teleconference, as Maliti referred in the previous intervention.
Great, thank you very much. Amelita, I don't know if you have anything further to add to that.
I'll pick up on two of the points, one of the potential positives and one of the potential negatives for teleworking. Louise mentioned that one of the great benefits of teleworking could be to reduce these peak hour trips. Often our public transport systems are designed to serve these very large peaks in the morning and the afternoon, as people are coming in and out of a central business district, let's say. And so if these peaks are attenuated, there is a chance that we could perhaps spread out the service, the public transport services over the course of the day, perhaps to different regions, beyond where it's currently served. This could have some major social benefits for individuals who don't necessarily have a 9-to-5 job and are reliant on public transport. If they need to access transport on odd hours or in different areas, not necessarily the central business district, there's a chance for that. So that's the positive. On the negative side, I think we're waiting to see what potential movements of people where they might choose to relocate if there is a large shift to permanent teleworking. If these commuting trips are replaced by, as Louise mentioned, longer trips in their area, if it's a more car-centric neighborhood that they live in versus what we call the 15-minute city that's been largely popularized in this last year as well. It's not necessarily a new idea, but the idea that you can access everything you need within a small radius. So depending on where people move, that we will see different impacts.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Amelithi, just one quick question. We will have the urban session obviously following hot on the heels of this one, but we talk about demand growth in passenger transport. Does that apply to urban demand as well?
Yes, to a certain extent. So if you're looking globally, yes, we do see growth in urban demand. If we look at demand per capita, so per person, we see two different trends emerging. So developed world regions see a reduction in per capita travel, given that they currently have very high rates of travel. This reduces, which shows that our accessibility focused policies are working for sure. The developing regions, we still see an increase in per capita trips or per passenger kilometers. And this is largely due to the fact that these are also areas of economic growth. They currently have very low trip rates or passenger kilometers per person, and this is expected to grow, but it still doesn't reach anywhere near the levels of developed regions. So this increase is just a reflection of increasing prosperity and quality of life.
Excellent. All right, that's great. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It has been very interesting discussing the results with you both. Thank you for your time and your insights. For those of you who are watching and participating, I would invite you to stick with us and join us for the detailed session on the urban mobility results, which will be following 5 minutes after this one. And we will have our invited guest speaker, Lina Marcela Quiñones of the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota, offering her insights on urban mobility. For those of you who are leaving us, I would still invite you to check out the Outlook on the ITF's Outlook webpage. You can also download summaries and results, and there is a link to the OECD statistics database where these results are also available. At the ITF exhibition stand, you can get the executive summary for the Outlook in several languages, which may be of use to you. But otherwise, I have nothing further to say other than that I hope to see you again in the next session, and have a lovely afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who are joining us from the previous session. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. In this session, we are going to discuss the results for urban mobility more closely, and I am joined by my colleagues Mallory Trouvé and Joshua Patanina Blanco to present the results of this chapter. We will then be joined for more in-depth discussion by our guest speaker, Lina Marcela Quiñones, the Director of Intelligence for Mobility at the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota. Throughout this session, I invite you to please use the Q&A box on your screen to submit questions. And please do take a moment to respond to our quick poll, which will inform some discussion later. And the poll, which you should be able to see also on the right-hand side of your screen, will remain open during the presentation. There is also a discussion box for you to chat with other participants, although I would bring to your attention that the discussion box is not monitored by ITF staff. So if there is a point you wish to raise with us for discussion, please do use that Q&A function. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, please use the red live support button in the top right-hand corner of your screen to raise assistance from the technical staff. And with that, I will now invite Mallory and Joshua to please present the findings for urban mobility. And I think, Mallory, you're to speak first, please.
Thank you, Ola. Sorry for this little delay. So thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Mallory Trouvé. I will present the results for the urban passenger transport sector of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 with my colleague Joshua Patanina Blanco. We want to highlight that Maliti Fernando is also an author of this analysis. And this session will focus on showing how cities can make mobility sustainable, equitable, and resilient. So first, a quick reminder of what Maliti presented a few minutes ago. So the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 aims at providing estimations of transport demand, CO2 emissions, and other indicators such as resilience or accessibility between 2015 and 2050. In order to do so, we built 3 scenarios. So the first policy scenario is a recover scenario, which is the current trajectory. Basically, if we keep doing the policies that we are doing today, and if we stay on track. The second policy scenario is a reshape scenario. This scenario is a paradigm shift from the recover scenario. Basically, all of the policy measures implemented in recover are implemented at a higher level. So for instance, higher congestion charge, quicker vehicle electrification, stronger incentives for active and micromobility. And last, the reshape plus scenario is a reinforced reshape building on a better answer to the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the Transport Outlook encompasses all of the transport sectors, this session is about urban passenger transport. So the daily mobility of people in a city setting. This analysis encompasses all of the urban area over the world. So I'll start by presenting the key a strong pressure on demand, which would almost triple by 2050. So urban travel demand is under a strong pressure. When we look at the effect of urban passenger transport emissions, if we stay on the current trajectory, the emissions wouldn't diminish much. They would just remain the same. This is not what we want if we want to reach the climate goals. While if we adopt a more ambitious policy setting, and if we have a better recovery from COVID-19, we could aim at reducing the emissions in 2050 by 80%. So there would be just a fifth of what would happen under the current trajectory. So we must adopt more ambitious policies to reduce to reduce CO2 emissions. When we go into detail at which mode is responsible for these emissions, well, clearly private vehicles are responsible for 75% of urban passenger transport CO2 emissions, while they only represent 51% of the demand. So we can say that private vehicles are the highest emitting mode. They're also relatively space intensive, especially when there is just one passenger per car. They are not available to everyone because it's expensive to purchase or even to maintain such vehicles. The paradox is that most of the transport systems are built for these modes, and a high share of the urban area is dedicated to their use. The point here is not to say that these private vehicles are bad things. They are actually very interesting solutions and they are useful, but the way we use them today is not efficient enough to reach climate goals. And the last finding is about resilience. So resilience is a difficult topic to address because there are many definitions of resilience. In this analysis, we consider resilience as modal diversity. Basically, the principle is that if there is a high modal diversity, then the system would better perform when one mode is disrupted. So here, when we look at the results, in 2015 and in 2050, under the current trajectory, the equilibrium roughly stays the same. There's just the apparition of shared mobility, but the modes are equivalent to what they were in 2015. While if we have a more ambitious approach, and if we leverage on the recovery from COVID-19, then we could really increase the share of shared mobility modes and of active and micro-mobility, which would increase the resilience. So increasing the variety of sustainable modes can increase resiliency at the same time. So now my colleague Joshua will present the main takeaways which are drawn from these findings.
Thank you very much, Mallory. Now, to present the four main takeaways of our study. The first one is that two main strategies can help manage demand and are needed to manage demand and deliver sustainable transport services across the world. One main strategy for developing regions and another one for developed ones. If you look at the graph at the left of the presentation, you can see the evolution of per capita demand in OECD and non-OECD countries. OECD countries in dark blue and non-OECD ones in light blue. What we see is that by 2050, per capita demand in OECD countries is going to increase slightly. But then in non-OECD ones, it's going to do so massively. As a result of this situation, per capita emissions, CO2 emissions in non-OECD countries are going to stay roughly the same by 2050 as they were in 2015. And in non-OECD countries, in OECD countries, per capita emissions are not going to decrease as much as they should if we want to meet wider environmental sustainability objectives. To meet this very unsustainable situation in developing world regions, it's essential that we leapfrog unsustainable patterns of demand growth. This means that we move away from having high levels of long-distance mobility by unsustainable modes, and that we focus rather on providing sustainable alternatives so that we can create a more innovative and sustainable future. In developed regions, rather, the logic should be to insist on optimizing very high levels of demand, for instance, by increasing occupancy rates of vehicles. Now, a second takeaway of our work is that there is a common policy principle that can help to achieve both of these strategies for developing and developed regions alike. And this is to focus on increasing access to nearby opportunities, for instance, by integrating transport policy and land use planning. Now, the idea here is to create cities that are neighborhood-centric. Imagine just cities where it would be possible to access essential opportunities, such as schools, shops, work opportunities, or hospitals, very close to where we live, and where mobility systems are designed to answer to this reality. If we comply with these criteria, it will be possible to shorten distances, and the distances that we will need to cover, we can do them by walking, by cycling, or by using public transport in a way that's cost-effective for authorities. Now, and this is very important, if policies are implementing while thinking about equity and the social sustainability of systems, it will be possible to really increase access for all population groups. This means for people who do not have a private vehicle, but also for people who have a particular impairment or who are otherwise disadvantaged in the current mobility system. Now, let's just try to look at what would be some of the main impacts of such an approach. As you see in the graph at the left, if we follow an ambitious approach and we aim at increasing access to opportunities, by 2050, per capita demand will still increase, but much less than if we hadn't increased ambition. But what's more important is that by 2050, because this demand in such an ambitious scenario can be met by sustainable mode, then the decarbonization potential is massive. What I mean by this is that if we use the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, for instance, for making sure that in cities around the world it's possible to cycle more, then it will be possible to double the mitigation impact, the per capita mitigation impact, as we see in the graph in the right. Now, there is a main idea behind all of these principles, and this is our third main takeaway, that for decarbonizing cities, it's important to reduce reliance on private vehicles. This can only be done if we increase ambition by aiming at reflecting the real cost of using a car or a private vehicle for society, but also by improving vehicle technology so that we can have cleaner transport fleets. If ambition doesn't change, by 2050, private vehicles are going to fulfill 40% of demand and emit half of urban passenger transport emissions. But then with more ambition, and if we leverage on the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, then private vehicles will fulfill only around 1/3 of all demand and emit less than 1/3 of all emissions. Now, the idea here should be to provide real alternative and think about the social sustainability of systems. This means that in areas where private vehicles are currently the only way of traveling, it's important to provide alternatives so that people still have ways of traveling, especially in lower income areas. Our four main takeaway follows suit. If we want to provide real alternatives, we need to promote multimodal urban transport systems that have public transport at their backbone. And for this, integration with forms of shared mobility is going to be crucial. This is because such integration can offer last mile connectivity in areas where previously public transport couldn't reach because of low levels of demand. But then it also makes the use of transport vehicles more efficient. Imagine just how more sustainable it would be to have 3 or 4 people in inside one car as opposed to only one. If authorities do this by also increasing the reliability, the frequency, the cleanness and the safety of public transport services, particularly for women when it comes to safety, it will be very possible to attract new users, and this is the key for a more sustainable future. Now, just to wrap up, we have 4 main key findings and takeaways. Urbanization will increase demand for sustainable transport around the world in the future, and 2 main strategies are going to be needed. One in developing regions to leapfrog unsustainable demand growth patterns, and one for developed regions to optimize very high levels of existing demand so that we can meet this sustainable future. There is a high potential for decarbonization. By 2050, it would be possible to cut around 80% of urban mobility's carbon footprint. But this can only be done if we really focus on increasing access to nearby opportunities, for instance, by integrating transport policy and land use planning. Now, we know that private vehicles emit 3/4 of CO2 emissions from urban passenger transport nowadays. So it's essential that we reduce reliance on private vehicles for decarbonizing cities. If we do this, we can increase the sustainability of systems, and this could mean in the future greater resilience. This will be necessary only by providing multimodal transport systems that have public transport at the backbone of them. These principles are going to be the key for a more sustainable urban passenger transport future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give back the floor to Orla.
Thank you both very much for that presentation of the more detailed results for urban mobility. And I can see that many of our participants have responded to the poll already, so I'm looking forward to discussing those very interesting results shortly. But first, I would very much like to invite Lina Marcela Quiñones of the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota to please join us and offer her insights on urban mobility, which we look forward to hearing. Lina, you are very welcome, and thank you very much for making the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Orla, and thank you, Mallory and Joshua, for that very interesting presentation. These results come in a very interesting time for Bogota, as we are actually launching our new, or like the process for a new urban development plan, which is called Plan for Territory Organization, Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial in Spanish. And so I am very happy to see that a lot of what is there and a lot of what we are working on at the Secretaría is actually very much in line with what Mallory and Joshua just presented. I want to highlight this very important figure of 80% reduction in CO2 emissions if we are actually more ambitious in our transport policies, in our urban transport policies. So it's a huge impact that we can have if we develop the right policies. For Bogota, we are actually having very ambitious goals. When we worked with Joshua and the team on this tool, we actually realized that we were being very, very ambitious already. We are aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050, which is a big goal, especially when you consider, and again, I'm talking about what Joshua mentioned, and is how in developing countries, or in such as Colombia, and especially in Bogota, the demand for passenger transport is increasing rapidly, and also motorization rates. In Bogota, we do have, let's say, favorable mode share, as in only 15% of trips are done by private car, which is very good. And actually our main mode of transport is on foot, with 24% of trips made on foot daily. But our main challenge is to keep that share the way it is, because we have seen how the share of private vehicles or trips on private vehicles has been increasing throughout the years, and how people are using public transport or traveling by foot, not because they choose to, but because they do not have access to other modes they may consider better. So we do have a challenge of making public transport attractive and comfortable, and as Joshua said, clean and safe. Especially after the pandemic, we have seen our ridership drop completely. A lot of people are migrating to bicycle use. Around 23% of the people that are using our temporary or semi-permanent bike lanes, our COVID bike lanes, were public transport users. So it's good that they are shifting to this mode, which is completely, it has no direct emissions, but it's also worrying that we are losing so many people that used to ride on public transit. So it's a big challenge there. Aside from that, we are also working on, going back to our land use planning. We are working on a 30-minute city, having more services accessible by walking and biking. And this is going to, there's a big push for this on our new land use plan. And then we are also working on making vehicle use more efficient, this private car use more efficient. We have a program called Pico y Placa Solidario. And so Bogota has had now for many years this scheme in which, according to the last number of your plate, you can or cannot take out your car on certain days. It works very well on the short term, but then we realized that people were just buying 2 cars so they can switch. And so we have been working on, maybe instead of just buying a second car, you can pay for a permit, and this will allow you to drive your car on the days that you're not supposed to. But at least, this is kind of internalizing the externalities that Joshua mentioned. And now we have added, since last year, another exception, and is if you are actually driving with at least 3 people in your car, I mean 3 people including the driver, then you can also take out your car on the days you have this restriction. So there has been a lot of acceptance of this measure. We have been quite successful in this. And it's very nice to see how people are willing to share, and actually that we can make this private vehicle use more efficient. And then I also want to get back on the COVID recovery and how can we actually harness what we learned or what has been happening to improve the way or rethink the way that we move around in the city. And we realize, of course, that a lot of activities can be carried out from home. Many people in Bogota, especially those who have more corporate jobs that are higher income people, they can actually work from home. They have realized that companies have realized that they can adapt quite quickly to people working from home. And then this is something that we actually expect to continue happening at maybe not on the same degree, but at some degree in the future after, well, hopefully after the pandemic is over. And this is actually interesting because then again, these are the people who mostly use private cars. So we might see some reduction on this also by people who are just not traveling every day to their jobs, just working from home. So overall, I think this outlook that ITF prepared is fantastic and is a very important input for everything that we are doing in Bogota. We have worked closely with the team, and ITF provided us with a tool that allows us to model different scenarios and actually connect this transport modeling with emissions, which is not something, I mean, we have our models and then we have our emission standards and how we calculate that, but connecting the two is very important for us so we can actually see what the impact of the policies we're planning will, what this impact will be. So thank you, Mallory, and thank you, Joshua, and everyone at ITF for developing this and for providing us with all this input. I'm very happy to see that a lot of what you mentioned is what we are doing in Bogota. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to comment on this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lena. It's fantastic to get feedback from a policymaker who is going through the sustainable planning process and has experience of implementing such a range of different policy measures that we would consider. We are also delighted to hear that the measures that we're mentioning align with what is being done there, and also that the tool is being used. So thank you very much for sharing those insights with us there. So I'm going now to turn, Lena, if we could stick with you maybe, and I'm just going to take a look at the poll results. So I think we can close the poll now. and if we share the results. So we have asked those in the audience, which decarbonisation measures do they think will be easiest for authorities to combine with the wider social and equity objectives after the pandemic? So there was a mixture of sort of mode share, longer term planning, and also changes to drivers of demand, which is the teleworking as mentioned there. And interestingly, our audience feel that the mode shift, so the promotion of either active mobility or public transport, and this is similar to results this morning, but a slightly larger share of respondents voted for mode shift to active mobility and public transport through promotion of those modes. Lena, in terms of the ease from your perspective of integrating these different measures into a decarbonisation plan that also respects social objectives, what do you think of these results?
So when it comes to transport sustainability, it's also a matter of equity and social equity, you know. As Joshua mentioned, or maybe Mallory, when we consider car use, it's the most polluting, it's the one that takes up most space, and it's also the one that is not affordable. And actually, for example, in Bogota, mostly the victims of road crashes, which are caused a lot by cars, are people who live in the periphery of the city, people who have lower incomes. So, and of course, are mostly pedestrians and motorcycle users, again, people who are, you know, lower income. So I think, you know, it's integrating sustainability with social equity it's very much, they're both very much in line. I do think it's not easy to implement actually on the ground a lot of these measures that we know we have to implement, that maybe Joshua mentioned in the end. It's a bit difficult for example, sometimes political reasons, sometimes bureaucratic reasons. You know, we have to go through a lot of steps. So there's where we have some difficulties. But, you know, as you guys mentioned, we just have to be more ambitious and believe in this and actually work on and implementing these measures.
Thank you very much. Mallory, would you like to comment on that from the perspective of the outlook and the work that you've been?
Sustainability. And so it's very important for us because when we designed the models which were used to produce these results, it was a big question, how to represent social impacts in models. Usually quantitative models are not very adapted for this. The data is rarely available to make this analysis. And so we try to use these models as much as we can to produce these results. And I think this outlook is a first step toward integrating more social indicators in our models.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mallory. So if anyone in the audience has more specific questions that they would like the participants to consider, please feel free to use the Q&A function in order to submit them. So we do have one question that has come through. Lena, if you would be okay with staying with us for a couple of minutes, it is directed to you specifically. So in Bogota, what is your plan for the electrification of buses, please?
That's a great question, thank you. So Bogota has a bus-based public transport system. We do not have yet, we are working on building a metro system that our mass transit is based on BRT, bus rapid transit. So actually, you know, we have a lot of potential to be game changers when it comes to bus electrification. And we have been working a lot on improving our public transport fleet. Transmilenio, which is the public-private company that manages public transport in Bogota, has actually acquired, or 1,485 electric buses to operate in the city. They are kind of regular buses, not the articulated buses that we use on the BRT system, but just the ones that are all over the city. And that actually has made us the city with the most electric buses outside of China. And we are very proud of that. And it's fantastic because we are actually, these buses are operating right now on the western part of the city, which is the one that has the most air quality problems. Particulate matter tends to concentrate there. And so it's very nice that these cleaner buses are actually replacing older polluting buses in these areas, which are the ones that most need it. And then we are also working on exploring other options for these articulated and bi-articulated buses that we need to operate on the BRT system. There are some pilots, some tests with a bi-articulated electric bus that I believe is the only one in the world, and it's in Bogota running tests. So we are working a lot on that. And not only public transport, we are also developing our electric mobility public policy, which I say it's with capital P, public policy, because it's just a document that has to follow a lot of rules and procedure that has been defined. And we are working also, we have a goal to encourage electrification of the taxi fleet, for example, which is also, a fleet that is very intensive in use and it's somewhat old. And so we have taxis that are even, older than 20 years running around Bogota. So we are also working on that. And it's quite new. Bogota has had a push for bicycles for like 40 years since we started Ciclovia, but this electrification is quite new, but we are moving ahead quite quickly, and proud and happy of that.
Great, thank you very much for that, Lina. And Mallory or Joshua, possibly Joshua, this is one for you. We've looked at public transport as a backbone of sustainable urban mobility. Do you have anything further to add in terms of the broader electrification or sustainable policies based on changes to public transport?
Sorry, just as a clarification, this is regarding the vehicle technologies, or also having a mode shift and having people use public transport more?
Starting with vehicle technologies, but also broadening out. There's no point in having empty, clean buses running around. So I suppose it's more sort of starting with the vehicle technologies, but then also moving towards the user-centered policies.
Of course. There are a few points in this. If we look at the efforts of Bogota, of course, they are remarkable. And it's a remarkable example, not only because it's very ambitious, but because it's a high level of ambition that we see in a city in a developing region. Now, if we look at cities in other parts of the world, many of them might have the difficulty to reach this level of ambition when it comes to decarbonization. Why is this? This is first because the potential of electrification for decarbonization depends on the energy matrix of the particular location. It's good to promote public transport, but if we think about electrified public transport in a place where the energy mix is not necessarily very sustainable, then electrification shouldn't necessarily be the first idea that should come to mind. Rather, public transport promotion in itself could be this key, be it, of course, by renewing fleets for more cleaner vehicles that are not necessarily electric, but also by insisting on public transport infrastructure. Now, there is something that is essential also from our results. When it comes to having public transport as the backbone of the mobility system, we see it as a way for public transport to serve as the coordinator of a mobility system that's really multimodal. And what do I mean by this? I mean that maybe some trips that were previously done by public transport now can be done by more sustainable modes. Instead of using public transport, you could even walk or cycle somewhere. So public transport in this case is relegated to the place where it needs to be used for middle to long distances. But this can only be achieved if everything else is articulated around public transport. So it's essential that we aim at having this system as the backbone of multimodal sustainable transport system for having proper behavioral change.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. I realize I broadened the scope of that question a little bit, but thank you, Lena, for the very specific example and response, and Joshua for the broader response. And Joshua, you mentioned about other regions in the world, and we had a question earlier, which I think is very interesting in terms of the drive towards public transport as a backbone. Is there anything further you can say on the formalization of informal transport that we have at the moment, please? And Mallory, you're nodding. I can ask you to follow up if there's anything further that you have to add. Thank you. Joshua.
Of course. In our study, we saw that paratransit services, informal transport services, depending on the term that you decide to use, are essential when it comes to understanding emissions in developing regions. In many developing regions, such as Latin America and the Caribbean or Sub-Saharan Africa, because a lot of transport demand is answered by informal transport, but then the fleets are very old, then paratransit can be a source of emissions. So if we formalize these services, but we keep old fleets, let's say that the potential for decarbonization is not necessarily as high as it could be. Formalization could, of course, come for push for renewing fleets. Then it's especially essential that we focus in integrating these newly formalized services into public transport services. If we don't have this integration with public transport, then newly formalized services could come as a competition for public transport. And this, on the opposite, could just create more problems for cities. So it's important that when we think about formalization, we think about real integration. Now, we didn't necessarily look at the political economy of how these changes would happen. This is something that each city needs to explore on its own, but it's definitely something that needs to be thought of. So thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Joshua. And with your political economy answer, you got there ahead of me. So thank you very much for adding that in as well. Now, Mallory, I had hoped there were also questions about the model, but I'm conscious that we are going to run out of time very quickly. So maybe you could just give us a quick indication of how the CO2 emissions per capita evolve for urban mobility by the different regions.
Well, basically, there is, as Joshua has presented earlier, we have two main directions. We have the developed countries, which already have high levels of CO2 emissions per capita, and the emerging regions who have low emissions per capita. The idea is to optimize and to reduce the emissions per capita from the most developed regions, and for the emerging economies to avoid reaching the levels of developed economies. The idea behind this is that anyway, emission in emerging economies will face the strong challenge of the huge pressure on demand, which is coming from the demographic and economic growth at the same time. But they should make efforts to avoid translating this into a strong increase in CO2 emissions per capita.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There were so many more questions that I had on my list to ask, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I would like to say thank you very much to Lina Marcela Quiñones for joining us today and for sharing such valuable insights and specific examples of these actions. So moving from advice to action, and Lina is the great example, or presented great examples rather, of that this afternoon. So for those of you looking for more information from the Outlook, you can download the Outlook and summaries from the ITF Outlook webpage, and the results are also available from the OECD statistics page. If you would like to visit the ITF stand in the exhibition hall on the virtual platform, you can also get the executive summaries in several different languages. I will encourage you, please, to stick with us to return to your timeline and join the non-urban passenger session, which will be starting in 4 minutes. So I really must leave, but thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you again to our guest speaker and to my colleagues, and I wish you all a very happy afternoon.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second non-urban passenger transport session of our Outlook launch. A warm welcome to those of you who have just joined the program. My name is Malithi Fernando, and I am a co-author and the project manager for this edition of The Outlook. It is my pleasure to be moderating this session today. You will be hearing shortly from my colleagues Demetrius Papaioannou and Vatsalya Sohu, who will present our findings on the future of the non-urban passenger transport sector. After that, we have the great privilege of being joined by our special guest, Andreas Schaefer, who is a professor of energy and transport at University College London. He will be joining us for an interactive discussion that you will have a chance to participate in if you answer the poll question that is on the right-hand side of your screen. That'll feed into the discussion. Finally, for the last portion, we will be joined by Luis Martinez, the lead modeler at the ITF, who will join Demetrius and Vatsalya for a series of questions. So you're welcome to submit questions ahead of time using the Q&A box. It's on the right-hand corner of your screen as well. The poll question is there. You'll also find a discussion box. This discussion box is for you to chat with other participants, respond to what you're hearing. It will not be moderated by ITF staff, so if you want to ask a question, please do use the Q&A function. Finally, if you are experiencing technical difficulties, please use the live support button in the top right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. And with that, I will hand the floor to Demetrius to kick off our presentations.
Thank you very much, Malithi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I will be presenting now the main findings and the key takeaways from our chapter on non-urban passenger transport. Now, what is non-urban passenger transport? It is important to define that. What we mean by this expression is all passenger activity which happens outside and between cities. So when we're talking outside of cities, we call that regional transport. We are talking about rural and peri-urban movements that happen by surface modes. We're talking about daily trips that people living in these areas do. When we're talking about intercity transport, that is movements between cities, we are talking about travel that happens between cities by surface modes, ferry, or air. Now, why is non-urban passenger important? First of all, it represents more than half, about 60% of all passenger activity and the corresponding emission. Second of all, it is a sector that is notoriously difficult to decarbonize, at least some parts of it, because it is much more dependent on fossil fuels. And last but not least, it has been significantly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, activity on the sector reduced by almost 40%. Aviation, as you probably know, was particularly affected by the pandemic. It had a reduction of total activity by almost 60%. More importantly, when looking at the international aviation segment, it was even more affected by border closures, quarantine requirement, leading to a total reduction of almost 75%. Now, let me recap very briefly the three policy scenarios that we have tested in this outlook. First of all, we have the recover scenario. This scenario represents our current trajectory. It talks about the policies that are currently in place or are announced. They are planned to be put in place in the future. Then we have the reshape scenario, which talks about a paradigm shift. It talks about scaling up our ambition, implementing more policies with higher ambition. I need to point out that in both these scenarios, the effects of the pandemic are not visible beyond 2030. The transport sector and the economy recover. That is slightly different on the reshape scenario, where some of the after effects of the pandemic linger on, but they are leveraged in a positive way in order to accelerate the uptake and deployment of decarbonization policies. And through this scenario and through these assumptions, it helps us reach our climate goals faster and with more certainty. Now I will present some of our key facts, key findings that came from our work on the outlook. First of all, let's talk about demand. Demand measured in passenger kilometers. So demand for the sector, both in regional and intercity travel, will grow. It will grow regardless of scenario. As you can see on the figure, shown on your screen, the demand will more than double. And the difference between the two scenarios that are shown here, the Recover and the Reshape Plus, is very small. So this signifies how demand management for the sector, for regional and intercity travel, is particularly difficult. However, if we look, the growth is asymmetrical between OECD and non-OECD countries. In countries of the OECD, the growth in non-urban passenger transport is around 40 to 45% in both these scenarios. By contrast, the demand for regional and intercity travel in non-OECD country almost triples. This highlights a departure from OECD countries being the center of non-urban activity globally. By 2050, the developing nations that are part of the non-OECD group will generate the majority of non-urban passenger activity. How does that translate in emission? Well, depending on the policies taken, CO2 emissions from the sector could either rise or fall. And as you see in the graph, under the current policies, under the Recover scenarios, the emissions will grow by as much as 25% compared to 2015 levels. Of course, this is a relative reduction compared to demand growth, which more than doubles. So some of the policies and technologies that are under development will have an impact on emissions. However, emissions will still rise. Nonetheless, if more ambitious policies are put in place and combined with the COVID-19 recovery, we could reduce CO2 emissions by as much as 57%. So it is important to point out how this sector is really at a crossroad. We could either go one direction where emission will continue to grow, or in a different direction where higher ambition and combination of the lingering effects, the after effects of the pandemic and the recovery packages could reduce emissions drastically. Finally, let's talk about aviation. Aviation, as we mentioned before, is a sector that has been hit particularly hard from the pandemic. However, according to our projections, it will recover. By 2025, aviation demand will be at pre-pandemic levels. Looking forward, by 2050, air travel could triple compared to the 2015 values. As you can see in the two scenarios here, the growth is slightly bigger on the current trajectory, and this represents number of trends that are taken into account for the Reshape Plus scenario. These trends, such as teleconferencing and increased localized tourism, reduce overall aviation demand. But we must also point out that this reduction is also a result of other policies which favor and encourage surface travel, especially for short distance trips. Now, with this, I finish the key facts I had to say, and I will give the floor to my colleague Vatsalia Soho.
Thank you so much, Dimitris, for those very insightful findings. As Dimitris mentioned, carbon emissions from this sector could be about 57% lower in 2050 as compared to 2015, with ambitious policies that leverage the decarbonization opportunities of the COVID-19 recovery. I will now present our key takeaways in this context. To begin with, our results show that technological improvements offer the most promising path to achieve the targets in this sector. This can be explained through applying the avoid, shift, improve approach in this context. So, avoiding travel by leveraging the trends that have emerged in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, promoting local tourism and encouraging teleworking and video conferencing to avoid business trips. Shifting to cleaner modes, so substituting high-speed rail for short-haul flights. This can be encouraged through designing recovery packages that help shift travel from air to rail. And we've already seen this, for example, with the French recovery package. And lastly, improving energy efficiency. For road transport, this can mean promoting the use of more energy efficient vehicles. And for aviation, this can mean encouraging new aircraft designs, the development of hybrid and electric aircraft, and increasing the use of sustainable aviation fuels through mandates. Moving on, to ensure the transition to a low carbon mobility, it is important to increase customer confidence in cleaner technologies and also to push for a cleaner energy grid. Now, in order to increase consumer confidence, it is important to deploy charging infrastructure along intercity and regional networks to overcome range anxiety and accelerate adoption. Major push can also come from incentives. This can be purchase subsidies and tax rebates and exemptions for electric vehicles. Specifically targeting rapid electrification of high usage fleets, for example, taxis and ride-hailing fleets, can also have a big impact. Secondly, pursuing a cleaner energy grid is key as regional travel comes to rely more and more on electricity. Without green electricity generation, transport emissions will simply shift to the energy sector instead of being mitigated. Emerging economies, which are still dependent on fossil fuels for power generation, must prioritize the transition to a greener grid. Last, but certainly not the least, putting a price on carbon will discourage high emission transport and make cleaner alternatives more attractive. Here, carbon taxes can play a very important role in making the CO2 intensive transport internalize the environmental as well as societal cost of carbon emissions. Additionally, for a just transition, it is important to design revenue neutral and fair schemes so as to not leave behind the less affluent. Lower income groups often bear the brunt of regressive taxation. Hence, it is essential to design these packages in a way that avoids unfair burdens on the vulnerable groups. This can also mean using revenue from carbon pricing to fund incentives for clean mobility so as to increase the acceptability of these alternatives. Now, to quickly summarize, we see from our findings that the demand for regional and intercity travel will continue to grow strongly, regardless of the scenario. We also see a rebound in aviation and continued growth till 2050. This means that decoupling emissions from travel demand will be crucial. And it is possible to reduce emissions in this sector by 57% by 2050, only by deploying ambitious policies and leveraging the recovery from the pandemic. As mentioned, this can be achieved through measures like increased deployment of technological improvements and ensuring consumer confidence in them, greening the electricity grid, and implementing carbon taxation schemes that prioritize equity. I finish here, and I would like to thank you all very much for your time. And with that, I hand it back to our colleague Maliti. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vatsalya and Demetrius, for sharing those findings with us. We are now going to be joined by Professor Andreas Schaefer, who will be starting off our discussion looking at options to decarbonize one of the most difficult sectors, aviation. So, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maliti. It's a pleasure to participate in this interesting session. Now, having participated in the previous or attended the previous session and this one, the differences could hardly be larger. In urban transport, you can substitute almost everything. You can substitute the mode, you can substitute the fuel, you can substitute the layout of the infrastructure. Now, it's still hard to reduce emissions, of course, but this luxury condition does not exist in non-urban transport, as has already been mentioned by Demetrius and Vatsalya. Nevertheless, there are opportunities, and the outlook summarizes this quite nicely. And the key opportunity here is certainly on surface transportation in terms of reducing the related CO2 emissions, because the technologies, in order to make a difference, they are all commercially available. They may still be a little bit expensive in terms of battery electric vehicles, but the battery technology continues to improve, the costs come down, and it may just be a question of time, or it will be just a question of time, as policies are already in place, once electric vehicles take over and displace internal combustion engine vehicles. And then, as has already been mentioned, it depends on the CO2 intensity of the power grid that will then ultimately determine CO2 emissions. So that's good news. But the bad news here is that there's a mode shift from surface transportation to air transportation, and the relative importance of air transportation and the absolute importance, of course, continues to increase. And that's worrying from an environmental perspective. First of all, it's a very stable trend, as the outlook shows. You can restrict passenger choices quite significantly with respect to long distance travel, and nevertheless, demand for air transportation continues to increase. So you can make the argument, if behavior doesn't change, technology must. And it also must change in the air transportation sector because of its relative importance as it is the leading supply system, transportation supply system in intercity travel. If technology has to make the difference, then we come to the real challenge, namely that while technologies that make a difference are commercially available in surface transportation, they are not at air transportation. We can think about beautiful technologies that make a difference, but they first have to be developed. They have to be produced at scale. And then we need to allow for time, a sufficient amount of time for these technologies to enter the market. And we've got the year 2021 now, and by 2050, we need to be close to or at 0 CO2 emissions. So that's an enormous challenge. Now, what technology solutions can we think about? Well, I can think about two fundamental options. The first one is we continue with improving mainstream aircraft technology as we did in the past. And these improvements have been quite significant. They have just been outpaced by the strong demand growth. But we develop carbon neutral synthetic hydrocarbon fuels at very large scale, at gigawatt scale. And again, these technologies are not proven at that scale. Now, these fuels, they can be produced from biomass, mainly cellulosic or woody biomass, because these feedstocks are comparatively abundant and don't directly interfere with our food supply. Or these fuels can also be produced from hydrogen and carbon monoxide mixtures. That's proven technology, but first you need to get the you need to produce the carbon monoxide, and the way to do it in a carbon neutral way is to extract the CO2 from the atmosphere and then catalytically reduce it to carbon monoxide. That's not proven at scale. There are only pilot plants operating at very small levels. Now, each of these two options has advantages and disadvantages, but again, common to both of them is that they are not proven at scale. Now, alternatively, we can develop different type of aircraft, in this case, hydrogen aircraft. Now, this is technologically extremely challenging, but there is no possible from an engineering perspective. But this requires a completely new supply system. And supply system in this case includes fuel production, distribution, and storage, and the aircraft themselves. And all airports, of course, would have to be better fitted accordingly. And these hydrogen aircraft could start coming online in 2035. Now, replacing the existing jet engine aircraft by 2050 would be quite a stretch, especially given the long lifetime of the assets in place. So aircraft on average live for around 30 years on average. This means after 30 years, only half of the cohort is withdrawn. So introducing aircraft today, half of those would still be flying in 2050. So you would need to retire, early retire, relatively new aircraft and sufficiently quickly design and produce alternative vehicles, which is, again, quite a challenge. Now, pursuing any of these two options, either continuously improving mainstream aircraft technology and changing the fuel in terms of producing synthetic hydrocarbon fuels, or changing everything with respect to moving towards a hydrogen economy, is highly capital intensive. And this situation is not eased by the COVID situation, because the market capitalization of the critical companies has dropped significantly, between 50 and 70%. They have hardly funds to keep the lights on. So Industry will not be able to make significant investments, and these investments, they're in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So this means government has to take a leading role, at least initially, until industry has recovered and can participate in making these very capital-intensive investments. Now, there are isolated examples in France, in Germany, and the UK in terms of supporting the development of these new clean technologies. But that's only a drop in the ocean. The requirements for capital are significantly large. And again, this must be hundreds of billions of euros. So they have to be increased. And importantly, given what's at stake, these efforts, they need to be coordinated internationally. And I think that's my main comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. That you certainly laid out some of the challenges and some of the potential solutions for the aviation industry, and especially coming out of this pandemic. So perhaps I will now take this opportunity while we have all the presenters and Andreas on screen to take a look at the poll results. Let me just close that and share them. We have very different results from what we had in our morning session. So the question is, where does the biggest opportunity lie to decarbonize non-urban passenger transport? And with 40% of the votes, we have infrastructure developments. So this is ultra high-speed rail, charging infrastructure for road vehicles, etc. And the others are, the next one down is the engine and fuel efficiency improvements across all modes, so aviation, road, etc. And with no votes is the development and uptake of policies mandating blend-in fuels. These are very interesting results. I think in the morning we had quite a popular set of choices for demand management and alternative powertrains. So first off, Andreas, I'll turn to you to comment on perhaps our most popular options, infrastructure development and engine fuel efficiency, or perhaps why you might find those surprising, or if you have any alternative thoughts.
My brief discourse must have been terribly ineffective, because I was hoping to make the case that we actually need enormous investments in alternative fuels. Efficiency improvements are important, of course, and they have been occurring in the past. At the moment, it's around 2% per year on a fleet level. And they will continue to happen simply because airlines, they try to minimize their direct operating costs in order to be profitable. In terms of high-speed rail and the like, wherever there's an opportunity and it makes economic sense, it should certainly be pursued. But there are many places in which substituting air travel by high-speed rail is simply not feasible, at least not at scale. If we look at the US, for example, there are a number of 10, 12 high-speed rail corridors on the East Coast and West Coast, and some high-speed rail already exists on the East Coast. But that's about it, because they run through high population density areas, or they run between cities that are sufficiently large in order to generate the demand. For example, San Francisco, Los Angeles. But the air transportation system is highly dispersed. There are many flights to less populated areas in remote regions where high-speed rail is just a big no-no, because the enormous capital investments would never, ever be recovered. And that's the vast majority of passenger flows that we are talking about. In terms of the combination of the three, well, yeah, I believe we should pursue all of these options, and wherever it makes economic sense, do introduce high-speed rail. Of course, for surface transportation, we need more charging stations for battery electric vehicles and the like, but that seems to be a question of time. Again, engine efficiency improvements are important. They will happen anyway, but we need to change the CO2 intensity of the energy carrier that we consume. And that only is possible with moving or shifting towards low carbon fuels.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Demetrius, would you like to come in with some thoughts on these results?
Sure, thank you. And may I add, because I was watching the poll, I believe most of the respondents gave the response before your section, Andreas. So I don't think you failed in convincing them. I mean, maybe we can relaunch it. You never know. So I will agree with most of the points that Andreas made. I do believe we need a multiple point strategy. You need to put infrastructure where is in place, such as high-speed rail. We definitely need to have the charging infrastructure along our intercity and regional road network. Perhaps this would be a way to reverse the trend that we mentioned. As we see more and more intercity travel happens by air, perhaps if these alternatives exist, you could reverse or halt this trend. However, I also do agree with Andreas that we do need to reduce the intensity, the carbon intensity that comes out of aircraft, because for most transport, especially when we're looking at distances above 1,000, 2,000 kilometers, air travel is the only option. We must, of course, also look at possibilities on managing that demand, whether that demand can be shifted. But as we have seen and mentioned, there is little potential for that on the sector.
Thank you, Demetrius. So I think that brings us to the close of our discussion section. I would just like to ask that perhaps Andreas stay with us for a quick moment while we move to the Q&A session so that we can ask you a couple of questions as well. But I will now introduce Luis Martinez, our lead modeler, who will be joining us to take some of your questions. So please feel free to keep adding questions in the Q&A box, but to get us started, I will kind of continue some of the conversation around sustainable aviation fuels and pose this to Andreas. How do you think the aviation sector will compete with other sectors for some of these new fuels? Is that a consideration? Do you foresee that as an issue?
That's the big unknown, I believe. Also because there are already policies in place that allocate, biofuels to the road transportation sector, for example, the low carbon fuel standard, for example, in the US, also California, I don't know the details anymore, which distorts the picture, of course. And ultimately you would think the sector that has the strongest challenge in terms of substituting fuels or reducing CO2 emissions would have the highest willingness to pay for that scarce resource. But given the distortions in place, of course, it's questionable what the outcome will be. It depends on the policies. Ideally, you would remove all of these distortions and subsidies and regulations, and then let the market decide. And presumably, in this case, aviation would be willing to pay the highest price.
Thank you, Andreas. Adding on to that, Andreas has mentioned the cost and the pricing. What role does carbon taxation play in the results that the Outlook presents? Perhaps this is a question for Luis. How does carbon taxation feed into both, aviation demand as well as the other modes that we look at?
Yes, thank you, Mariti. Carbon taxation presents a big challenge also for the changing on the cost structure of aviation and other modes, but currently in the model it's mainly on trip production. We have some trips that get frustrated because some of them go on modal transfer, but it's for trips that are more compatible with other modes in ranges, especially as Dimitris mentioned, lower than 1,000 kilometers, and there is a land connection. If not, we are talking mainly about trips that are suppressed. But the suppression with the levels of carbon taxation that we tested, they are not enough to really make a significant reduction on demand. We are talking on an increase that could go up to 10% of prices for medium long haul and 10% of or 15% of increase of the pricing of a ticket, this doesn't really change us back to the levels of the 90s, especially if we are still going forward with costs that are steadily preserving, and we see that the GDP per capita is still increasing. Then I think there is here a challenge also in the level of the carbon taxation that we impose. That if we see that the technology, as Andreas mentioned, doesn't advance as enough for us to reach the targets, we have to really be able to better use some tools that will control demand if we want really to achieve the market. Then we have is to compensate and assess what is the outcome for the economy, also for some constraint on the aviation. And this is a more theoretical exercise that goes beyond what we explored in the ITF outlook, but I think this is quite important also to see the spillovers of this measure.
Thank you, Luis. It's good to understand the modeling theory and application behind this. Vatsalia, perhaps a question for you, building on this idea of carbon taxation. It is rather controversial, and we've seen around the world that it's not necessarily an easy measure to implement. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can make sure that implementation is fair and does not unfairly burden certain populations?
Thank you so much, Mandy, for that question. Indeed, it is, we've seen it in the last few decades even, that the uptake of carbon taxation has been met with opposition and has been very slow. This is mainly because apart from the complexity of implementing these taxes, they're also often regressive in nature. So what happens is they affect lower income households more than they would impact higher income households. So there's a lot of opposition in the acceptance of these measures. Now, there are ways to make carbon taxation more fair and just, and this can be through making carbon taxation revenue neutral. So we've already seen this in a lot of countries, actually. There's examples from Sweden, Denmark, even Canada, where the revenue generated from these taxes is used to maybe offer labor subsidies or to fund cleaner alternatives at the same time, or even cases where introduction of taxes on energy products has been complemented with a reduced income tax rate. So there are ways of making these taxation mechanisms fairer and more just, and making sure that they don't unfairly impact the vulnerable groups. At the same time, I think, as has been mentioned already, it's very important to complement carbon taxation with cleaner alternatives and deploying, say, charging infrastructure, especially in the case of non-urban transport, non-urban passenger transport, along regional and intercity routes where uptake of these cleaner modes is a bigger problem than in urban areas. I think I will stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vatsalia. So we've talked about carbon taxation. We have one question from our audience that asks about purchasing carbon credits for travel. Demetrius, I'll ask you about this first. This seems to have been a bit of a fad for a while for tourism or business. Is this still a scheme that is ongoing or on the horizon? Does it have, what kind of effect does it have? Demetrius, perhaps you could kick us off.
Thank you. Well, I mean, when we talk about carbon taxation, we do have a variety of measures. Carbon credits could be one of them, would be characterized as a cap and trade scheme. We do have offsets, and ICAO is launching Corsia, which will have increased costs when emissions go over a certain level. We could even have a direct tax that is imposed on emissions. Now, whether this is a fad, maybe I believe the system was not ready for that. I do believe that if we want to advance and encourage the adoption of new technologies, some sort of pricing mechanisms will be necessary. Now, obviously, as a user, as a customer, you would not want to pay more, or a large segment of the population would not want to pay more. So it's something that needs to be put in place with great urgency, because the whole discussion about the climate, it's more than a discussion, it's an urgency, and acting now would allow us to reduce our emissions faster.
Thank you, Dimitris. I have a question on high-speed rail versus air. This was a discussion that Andreas brought up and we discussed during the poll. Luis, perhaps you could take a first attempt at this, and Andreas, Dimitris, Vatsalia, if you would like to come in, just signal. Are there specific known locations or regions where high-speed rail is available or is planned, where it would be more efficient to use air travel due to it not being a dense area?
Thank you, Melody, for the question. I'd say it's also how you define efficient, because if it's efficient from an energy perspective or emissions, or efficient from economic perspective, as Andreas mentioned, you need a certain level of demand to be justified and be too cost effective, and to justify the operation and the maintenance of all the rail tracks and also the vehicles. Then there is another component, that is the viability of the high-speed rail connections to exist. And then if you consider all the cost benefit, not just the emissions, yes, there are cases that have been proven even that air connection would have even a cost benefit higher than the high-speed rail. But depends on how you define then the efficiency and how you internalize the cost and the benefits on the contabilization, the account.
Thanks, Luis. One point that Andreas brought up during his part was about the long lifetimes of planes. Around 30 years, I believe, was the number quoted. Would it make sense to, from an environmental or economic perspective, to retire aircraft early, something similar to vehicle scrappage schemes? Is this something that is being looked at? Has it been looked at? Is it effective? Andreas, perhaps I'll start with you.
Well, it has happened in the past, but not often, of course, because it's a very expensive measure. And this was as a result of the introduction of more stringent aircraft noise regulations, I believe, in the 1960s. But again, it's a very expensive measure, and you need to be desperate if you move into that direction.
Thank you. Dimitris, would you like to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would like to add is that in our modeling work in the outlook, we do consider the increased cost that would come from such a scrap as an early retirement of planes, especially when we're looking at hybrid electric and all electric aircraft. So this is to come in advance of any questions which might ask if our results take this into account. But I do agree with what Andrea said.
Thank you, Dimitris. We are nearly out of time, so perhaps a quick 30-second answer from Luis. Do we look at, so we looked at electrifying road vehicles in the model, and we've also mentioned the importance of clean energy grids. Do we have any sort of analysis included in the outlook on what the impact of moving to electrification with the current energy grid might look like? Is it actually a net benefit?
Yes, and we have always, because combustion engines, they are not very efficient, even with the increases that we have currently, even with the grid that we have currently, even in areas where they were very carbon intensive, they are even reductions and savings on the switch for electric. The thing is also the infrastructure to be available and also that could allow electric, of course, to have a full advantage is much. We should ensure that the grid is also cleaner. But yes.
Thank you. So people can go see the outlook for more details on that. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much to my colleagues, Dimitris, Vatsalia, Luis, and a very special thank you to Andreas for joining us. It has been lovely having this time to discuss all these very challenging topics with all of you. For those who are interested in more on the Outlook takeaways, please visit the ITF exhibition stand in the Summit portal, where you can download the executive summary in 9 different languages. You can also visit the ITF webpage, where we have links to the publication itself, recordings of these sessions, the modeling results that you can download as well. And finally, if you would like to join the last session of the Outlook launch today, we will be focusing on freight transport, and it starts in 5 minutes. You'll need to navigate to it using the Back to Timeline button on the top left-hand corner of your screen. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you there. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the final session of our ITF Transport Outlook launch. This session focuses on freight transport, and for those of you who have just joined the program, welcome. To those who have stuck with us right from the beginning, it's great to have you still here. My name is Malithi Fernando, and I am a co-author and the project manager of this edition of the Transport Outlook. It is my pleasure today to be moderating this freight session. You will hear shortly from my colleague Francisco Furtado, who will present the findings for the future of global freight transport. We are then delighted to be joined by Jan Havenga, who is a professor in the field of macro logistics from Stellenbosch University. He'll be kicking us off on our interactive discussion, and you are most welcome to participate in this discussion through the poll. The poll is on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can answer that. It'll remain open until after Jan's first few words. And you can also participate in our Q&A session, for which we will be joined by Luis Martinez, our lead modeler at the ITF. The Q&A function is on the right-hand side as well. Please ask your questions there. There's also a discussion box if you would like to chat with the other participants. But if there are questions for our panelists, please do include them in the Q&A box. If you have technical difficulties, you can access support through the live support button. It's on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And with that, I believe that's it for housekeeping from me. I'll hand it over to Francisco to kick our presentation off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Malithi. Good evening or good morning, depending where you are watching us. I'll jump right in to some of the key facts, some of the key findings we obtained and are presented in the freight chapter of the Transport Outlook. And I ask all our viewers one question. Did you know that freight accounts for more than 40% of transport emissions? And actually in 2020, this past year, according to our estimates, half of all transport emissions were done by freight, by the movement of goods. Of course, it was a very particular year, as we know, due to the COVID pandemic. And while personal mobility was highly restricted, goods and supplies had to keep moving. And the activity, the volume of activity of passenger transport fell in a much more drastic way than what happened to freight. Actually, some segments of freight increased. For instance, in urban logistics and deliveries, it actually increased. Now, on the long run, when we take a longer term perspective, the share of freight emissions is going to remain more or less stable. It also depends a bit on the scenarios. And in some of them, like you can see here in this slide, it can actually slightly increase. Now, despite all of this and the relevance of freight and emissions, the truth is that historically, this is a sector that has received much less policy attention than the passenger sector. And this is reflected in simple things like even the knowledge public authorities have of the freight sector, of the agents involved, and even data collection. Now, with the COVID crisis, there was a great increase in the public awareness of logistics in freight increased a lot during this pandemic. People realized the importance of the sector. It was more visible than before. And I think this is and we think in the ITF, this is also an opportunity to leverage this increased awareness and to increase the policy focus, particularly for decarbonization policies, but also of the general public and interest in the sector, and also for other type of policies. Now, another important figure is that when you look at the emissions from freight, a great majority of them is actually done by road. And by road, here we include both the non-urban type of trips, but also the urban and delivery movements. And as you can see in the graph, the share of road actually increases as you move forward in time, and this happens in all of the scenarios. So we have here a sector that when you measure in 10 kilometers, the activity represents about 17% of the total freight movements, but the emissions are two-thirds of the emissions, 17% of the activity. Well, this highlights the importance of promoting the attractiveness of multimodal solutions that include modes that are less carbon intensive than road, but there are limits to what can be achieved that way, and road transport has several characteristics, for instance, flexibility, accessibility, which are unmatched, and so it will always remain a key component in the transport chain. So it's a critical front to decarbonize. The decarbonization of the road sector itself, it's critical to achieve the freight transport decarbonization, and I would say transport decarbonization as a whole. Now, this is the last critical number I have to leave you with, and it's that if we continue with the current trajectory, with the current ambitions, and we do a return to normal, we are not going to achieve the climate mitigation targets. Actually, there's going to be an increase in emissions from this sector. Now, with ambitious policies, it is possible to decrease. And if we add to these ambitious policies, we leverage also some of the trends coming out of the COVID crisis, then we can achieve a 72% reduction in emissions comparing 2050 numbers to 2015. And what explains this gap and this reduction and this difference between the scenarios, first and foremost, is the increase in efficiency and the adoption of clean energy sources across all transport modes. And doing this in a very widespread and mainstreaming these clean energy sources. This is the first element. There's a second element, which is the decrease in demand for fossil fuels like oil and coal. And if you think about it, currently, the transport of this type of commodities represents 30% of international freight movements, which are the majority of freight movements, constitute the majority of freight movements. So if we move towards a decarbonized world, not only in transportation, but also in energy production, manufacturing, habitation, etc., we will decrease the consumption of fossil fuels and the demand for transporting them. And this will slow down the growth in demand of freight. Another final element to this is an increased focus on resilience, on the diversification of supply chains, trade regionalization, and all of these trends would also help to slow down the demand growth. And then after seeing these key numbers, what are the main takeaways? Or we can also call it the key policy recommendations that you can see in the freight chapter or the freight component of the outlook. Well, first and foremost, to scale up, ready to adopt solutions. And many of these solutions are already deployed, but they are deployed in certain regions of the world and not in others. They are deployed for certain types of companies. For instance, in large companies in Europe, it's already common practice to have training for drivers, eco-driving. But for the small companies that actually constitute the bulk of the road freight sector, for instance, this is not such a common practice. So the first thing is to have these type of measures applied across the board, across all regions, and across all type of companies involved in freight transport. And a specific example or case of this happens in urban logistics, where actually there are already available solutions for low or zero tailpipe emission vehicles, namely for light commercial vehicles. and bikes and these type of vehicles. This is already available. In some circumstances, they are already commercially viable and more attractive than more classical conventional fuel solutions. So widespreading the adoption of these low and zero emission vehicles and fuels in the urban areas is one also of the critical areas. And other things like voluntary programs, which are associations, free associations between different shippers, carriers, and which constitute a privileged platform to disseminate best practices and also to offer motivation and incentives for the different companies to adopt these best practices. In addition to this, I would mention a boost in collaboration between the different carriers, between different parts of private companies in the sector, and doing this with the aim of increasing the use of available capacity that already exists in trucks or trains, but is not taken advantage to its fullest, or to reduce empty trips. And by doing this, by increasing the use of available capacity and decreasing the amount of empty runs, we are reducing the fuel that's consumed. We are increasing the efficiency, lowering costs, and also reducing emissions. Another key insight here, a key takeaway, is that we need to align the price incentives with the decarbonization ambitions. So few carriers will adopt low or zero emission solutions if they are more expensive than conventional vehicles and fuels. But what happens nowadays, in general, there are the negative externalities of and emissions from fossil fuels are not included in the price of these fuels. And quite the opposite, there are tax exemptions on fossil fuels, namely for aviation, also for shipping, maritime shipping, but also in other sectors of commercial activity. So one of the things we need to do is to phase out these tax exemptions and include these negative externalities and the costs of emissions in the price of fossil fuels. But we should do this taking into account equity and assuring there is a fair distribution of both the costs but also the benefits that come with the transition to cleaner energies. And this is assuring this fair share between different economic and social sectors. For instance, by including this carbon pricing, not introducing it per se, but including it in wider tax reforms, but also taking in account in the different impacts that these measures, like carbon pricing, but also slow steaming, can have in different regions of the world. And regions that are further from the main producing and consumption centers will be disproportionately affected by these measures. And nowadays we know, or according to our estimates, the surface emissions per capita in OECD countries are 4 times higher than in non-OECD countries. So this is definitely something to take into account when introducing these measures. Now, currently, the only transport mode for non-urban longer distance trips that has a consolidated, mature, and relatively widespread zero emission solution for this type of trips is rail. Actually, if you look at the aviation sector or heavy duty long haul road freight, there are no short-term perspectives of low to zero carbon energy sources being adopted in a widespread or in being mainstreamed in the short term. But we need this. We need this transition in these critical sectors to low or zero carbon energy sources if we want to achieve the climate goals. And to do this, these solutions need to be available and need to be attractive to the users and to the carriers and the companies. So for this, we have to align the price incentives. I just mentioned that. But another thing that can also help and will surely help is having standards, accelerating the standardization of these technological solutions, both on the vehicle and the infrastructure side, because this will help to scale up these solutions and it would also allow them to be more attractive for the end user. And lastly, a critical element in all of this, and I'll end with this, are the stimulus packages to recover the economy post-pandemic or in this new normal. We live in a time of crisis, but this is also a time of great opportunities. And the decisions we will take today will shape the future to come for decades. And these stimulus packages can include investments into research, into alternative fuel production, distribution, improving the attractiveness and availability of multimodal solutions, and also, I would say, a very important element, particularly in emerging economies, in incentives and support for renewing the vehicle fleets, which are much older in these economies than in the developed economies. And this per se would already also make a big difference. Thank you very much for your time. Meliti, back to you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for presenting those results and those key policy recommendations. We are now going to move on to our discussion. So I'd like to welcome Professor Jan Havenka, who will be starting us off with some comments on creating a more sustainable freight transport sector. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. From my side, a lot of the things that we struggle with in macro logistics, I actually picked up in this report. So it was wonderful to read it in many respects. I think one of the first things that I saw, which really just jumps out of the page, is the fact that we have a ton-kilometer forecast that is now lower than the pre-pandemic forecast. But the question is, when you ask yourself about it, why does it happen? It's probably driven by some of the things that you've mentioned, but also something like global trade. I think global trade has been adjusted downwards. This has been happening after every major upheaval in society. I remember after the 2008-2009 recession, the same thing happened and it never recovered. But at the same time, if we trade less, then what is going to happen is we're going to have more reshoring, we're going to have more nearshoring. That will increase surface transport much more. And the biggest portion of surface transport is road. And the one where we have the least good solutions is road. It's as simple as that. Things like integrated research agenda, standardization, meaningful technology sharing, that exists for other modes much more than for road. So that's my first problem that I see in this, is how we're going to solve that. The second one is that also was quite visible is what I call the material footprint of the developing world is much lower than the developed world. That is going to grow. We can have an increased middle class in those places, and we cannot negate that. That is actually going to put a huge pressure on this. And the only way in which we can drive this, or I can say we can manage this, is to understand that demand is not only going to come where it comes from now, where it's high. Demand is going to come from different places in future. And how we're going to manage that? With data, with information, with intelligence. And that's where a report like this makes a contribution that I really appreciate. The third one is, if I go back to Gary Hardin, he wrote a seminal article, Tragedy of the Commons, in 1968. And he already said, that if you have resources that are shared by a lot of people, then the society will bear a greater burden in the use of that resources than the person that actually uses it. And he talks about cross-subsidization, and he says there's only one way to stop it, and that is with user pay. The person that causes the damage has to pay for the damage. And I firmly believe in that probably will be one of the only ways in which we can solve this problem. The last point I wanted to make is we need urgent policy and infrastructure interventions. We really need urgent stuff. But in everything we do in terms of strategy, on a business level and on societal level, we need data. We need intelligence. We don't have enough of that. I have to say at the same time, publications like this Transportation Outlook goes a long way towards filling that gap. I really appreciate it. And maybe a last thought on my side, just a little bit tongue in the cheek. Every year, I look forward to this publication as one of those things that I can hang my hat on. So for me, it was a great honor to say these few words for the first time. Having always looking out to see this publication. Thanks for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Jan, for those very insightful and well laid out points. And thank you for your participation here today. We'll now take an opportunity to hear from our audience and respond to the poll results that are coming in. So let me just close this and share the results. The question was, in order to decarbonize freight transport while fostering economic recovery and equity, which of the following options should countries focus on? And the winner is align price incentives with freight decarbonization ambitions with 30% of the votes. Following behind with 22% each, we've got supporting technological development in clean energy sources, both for vehicle and infrastructure, and accelerate standardization procedures to speed up adoption of clean technologies. The least popular options, with just 4% each, were strengthening international cooperation and increasing data collection. So perhaps, Jan, I will start off with you, giving you a chance to respond to some of these findings. Some of these were mentioned, I think, in your piece just before, and I will note that the poll was answered before you spoke, so the answers may look very different. You have a chance to respond, though.
No, I would 100% agree with what I call the user pay principle. I think eventually that's the only way which you can solve it, although politically it's extremely difficult to implement. So that portion of it I would really agree with. I will not agree with the data collection portion of it. I think people see data as something, do we really need it, or that is just something that needs to happen anyway, and we don't invest enough in it. We desperately need more data and more intelligence. More data and more intelligence will drive a lot of the other solutions. It's more like a precondition. So I understand that. It doesn't stand out as a condition on its own, but it's a precondition. Without that, we can't actually have this discussion. If we had no data, there would have been no outlook to base our findings on. But the user pay principle, I would agree with that. If we can find a political way in doing it, that is maybe the problem. How will we do it? But if we could do it, that will solve it.
Thank you, Jan. And perhaps, Francisco, you could add to what Jan has spoken about and the results that we see coming in from our poll.
Yes, well, I'll first start to say I completely agree with what Jan just said, and even before, about the importance and relevance of data, and particularly on freight transport compared to the passenger sector, and from a perspective of the public authorities, the lack of data and knowledge of the sector shouldn't be underestimated. And if we want to, even to assure compliance of measures, if we want to assess the effectiveness of measures, if we want to study, develop policies to the sector, we need to have this data. So I think this is something that should not be underestimated.
Thank you, Francisco. With that, I think we can move on to our question and answer period. So I will ask Luis Martinez to join us. Luis is our lead modeler. Welcome, Luis. We still have time for more questions, so please do submit them if you do have them. I'll start off with a question for, let's see, I will start off with Luis. We often talk about freight emissions, but the location of these emissions does seem to vary between where the goods are produced, where they're transported to and from, and where they're consumed. Can you comment a little bit about how the ITF models try and account for this?
Yes, thank you, Maritie, for bringing me in. Yes, this is a very interesting element that we added on this year on the Outlook, because Normally, we are just trying to focus on policymakers on the emissions that happen within their geographical boundaries. And we forget that the consumers, as Jan was mentioning, the products come from elsewhere. Then Europe, for example, are just concerned on the goods that are transported within EU boundaries, but we see that Europe is the region in the world which consumes further. Then a lot of emissions are happening for arriving goods here, and these or either are happening in locations where they don't have resources enough to develop more infrastructure or reduce emissions so significantly. And this is one thing that we have to be aware and address. That's why the consumer principle that Jan was referring, this is quite important, because I think consumers are not aware and do not internalize in the cost that they pay part of the emissions that they are generating, and also the decisions that companies make regarding location may also be influenced because of this not internalization for the final consumer. Then it's important for us to understand also Europe has a higher level than other regions because of the fuel of fossil fuel, as Francisco was mentioning also before, which is a very large amount of the total of the freight transport, while other regions, they have their fossil fuels closer. Than Europe has also this a large share of the transport. The total transport is also of the fossil fuels. But nevertheless, that's an important element that we have to understand on the decarbonization of the sector, is that sometimes the markets of the consumer, which is in developing countries, which they consume most of the final consumer of the goods, they are not in the local.
And adding to that, there's the extra complexity of the international nature of some of the maritime emissions, for example, the fact that these emissions are not under one specific state's responsibility. How do you see these adding to the challenge of implementing a user pays principle? And do you have any solutions perhaps for actually implementing these kinds of measures?
Well, once again, it is a data issue. We will have to look at supply chains, and we will have to look at value chains. And the final consumer in the supply chain will have to pay whatever has happened in that supply chain. And obviously that cost will then flow back all the way back. So what will happen, for instance, to give an example, we produce grapes in Uppington. Uppington is 1,000 kilometers away from the Cape Town port, and that gets exported to the UK. The UK, the person there buying that, there will be a label on it that will say, this is the carbon emissions attached to this product. And that will go all the way back. And people will stop buying our grapes that came all the way by road over 1,000 kilometers if we don't do something about it. But eventually, if the final consumer pay for it, the money and the cost and the burden will flow all the way back in the supply chain. But I think it will have to be with final consumption. And it's as simple as that.
Thank you, Jan. A challenging topic, but very, very important, as you mentioned. A question now for Francisco. We've talked about the large portion of freight transport that happens on roads. What is the role of rail infrastructure? Can it replace road transport? Is there a limit? Where's the decision made typically to go for rail versus road in our most ambitious scenarios?
Well, first, a broad answer. There is a role for rail, definitely there already is, especially in the movement when there is high volumes between origins and destinations that generate big volumes of freight. And that's why all around the world, freight is very associated, for instance, with ports. And whenever there is a port that is not a port with a significant movement, that is not connected to rail, there is, I would say, a stellar opportunity to develop rail. And even in Europe, I think the easiest or the low-hanging fruit for rail is in developing the access to ports where they are not already developed. In the model, and Luis can also say something about this, Okay, we have a rather, I think I'd say rather complete modal choice that includes the travel times, includes by commodity type, the costs, includes also the characteristics of the infrastructure in place. And there's actually improvements to the infrastructure in certain regions that have already laid out plans and that we already studied, like in Europe, also in Central Asia. Now we are also in parts of Latin America, we are developing that. And actually an area where we see there is a potential growth for rail is in the Eurasian link. You know, this is also an area where we see that in the future there can be some growth.
Thank you, Francisco.
Let me say that it will never completely replace road transport.
Luis, did you have a quick point to add to that?
No, it was quite clear. As Francisco mentioned, because road has always a role on giving on the flexibility on the low demand areas, on the where there is no big volumes to be transported, because rail has the main role also to concentrate and consolidate high volumes to be transported, even cheaper and more efficiently even than maritime. Then we have to forget not that we are in some cases that rail is also not just competing with road. Yes, it is, but it's not competing. It has to collaborate with also sea, as Francisco was mentioning, but also in some locations where sea is not completely direct, there is a role also for rail on these connections.
There is. For instance, in the relocation of empty containers, rail is used actually.
Jan, did you have a comment?
In terms of railways, what is the biggest gap? And there's two big ones, and Francisco has mentioned the one. It's as simple as that. The containers that arrive in a port, it should be evacuated by rail in most cases. The biggest other option or opportunity is what we call domestic intermodal. There's the intermodal link between road and rail, where the large portion of the freight is in a container or a pallet-friendly container, and then the last mile is done both sides by road. This is a solution that exists very well in Europe. So Europe understands this. There's places like Hoekpak and Combiwagen, Combiverkeer and so on that does this type of thing. In America, domestic containers these days are more than ISO containers. There's more domestic containers on rail in America. In the developing world, it does not exist really. I see very little of that in India. There's nothing in South Africa. In India, where it should happen a lot of this freight that is palletized is on road. It should be on rail. It's long distances. It's 1,400 kilometer corridors. And you see all of these trucks, 60,000 trucks per day that goes towards Kolkata. And this just doesn't make sense. And the same in China, we just have that huge gap of intermodalism that we need to fill it. That's the biggest option. So that's the two, intermodal through the port and domestic intermodal.
Thank you, Jan. We have a series of questions that I'll group together for Francisco. Speaking about cleaner road transport, can highway charging solutions compare to hydrogen for long-haul freight? Have we thought about that? What do we think of highway charging, and what might be the role of biofuels? So a few different options for alternative energy sources for freight transport.
In the morning, I think we already discussed a bit hydrogen, so I will leave this a bit out. I'll just mention that when we look at the transition to clean energy and zero emission solutions, two key facts. First, in different regions of the world, different solutions can be more appropriate. And second, unlike what we have now, which is like a single energy source world, basically, which is based on oil, and then you have gasoline and diesel, in the future, there will be multiple energy vectors with biofuels, with hydrogen, electric roads to direct supply of energy, gas to biogas. So there will be multiple solutions in different regions of the world and for different type of operations. Like batteries nowadays, like I was mentioning, are already competitive for for the short distance light commercial vehicles. It's still an open question. Some people say yes, others say no, but there are even some announcements from some companies that they would have a battery truck, but I don't know. We still haven't seen it. At least I haven't. So, okay, I won't go along into that. But about biofuels in specific, the biofuels it's an awesome example of this, because one thing is biofuels in Brazil, where they produce using land that was abandoned, that was agricultural land, where they have a very high rich production of sugarcane that can be converted and made into ethanol, and where there is no land use, big land use impacts, etc. And it's produced and consumed locally, and several studies show that this is very sustainable, actually. Another thing is, for instance, Europe importing biofuels from Southeast Asia that come from the deforestation, and you're making biofuels after this forest. I mean, and this is not sustainable. So the biofuels depend on the context, and depend on how they are produced, on the emissions, even in the transport, and they might be a very good solutions in some cases, but not in others.
Certainly. Thank you, Francisco. We have just 1 or 2 minutes left. So Louise, I would like to pose a question on e-commerce and what the role of that is in freight transport emissions. Can you give us a quick comment, please?
Yes, as we saw in this recent year with the advent of e-commerce during COVID pandemic, we see that the role of e-commerce has growing and growing, and we have here it has to be managed. I think this is the main element of the e-commerce. Especially, we have the urban part, which is the last mile deliveries, or the deliveries within urban, that we saw a big increase in the last year, and we are envisaging this for the long term. The problem of the e-commerce also for the long distances, and also for bringing products into the city, is if we go increasingly to peer-to-peer dispatching of e-commerce, if we have products that come each singly from a very long distance, and if they are not consolidated into regional hubs that can allow you for use more sustainable transport sources to arrive to the city finally, then I think the big challenge of e-commerce is not the e-commerce existence per se, is the format of e-commerce that we have expanding currently, when we don't have, as John was mentioning, a user pay principle, that the user is not conscious of the transport CO2 costs that arrive to their final location. If we had already e-commerce within products that are already, for example, within Europe, when we are consuming and they come to you by rail or by an electric truck, if they become available or not, as we saw, or as another source that is more sustainable, this is completely different than if it comes like 3,000 or 5,000 kilometers by plane, everything that you ask. And I think that this is the big challenge.
Thank you, Louise.
And this is the policy element that we may need to tackle.
For sure. And I'm going to squeeze one last question in, given this is our last session. Francisco, perhaps you could take a first stab at this. How can governments ensure diversity in freight transport decarbonization measures instead of focusing primarily or mainly on pricing based measures?
Well, I'll start by saying pricing, and we discussed this extensively. It's very important. But per se, it's also not going to solve the issue, because if there is not the infrastructure to make available more sustainable modes, if there is no money into research to develop the new sustainable technologies, if there is no infrastructure for the production and distribution of these alternative fuels, and part of this, I think it's very hard if it's not, I wouldn't say fully public funded, but if there's not a major component of public intervention in this, at least in this side of the infrastructure, I find this very hard to happen. So this is just to exemplify that pricing is indeed fundamental, both for the end user, but also for the companies themselves, the private companies that operate. But it has to go along with a series of other measures that that allow the good incentives provided by pricing to be actually taken advantage of.
Thank you, Francisco. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Luis, Francisco, and a special thank you to Jan for being with us. And this is actually our last session. So if you would like more information about the Outlook, the executive summaries are available on our Summit portal. Those are available for free in multiple different languages. If you also visit our ITF webpage for the Outlook, you'll be able to download the modeling results. They're linked to the OECD statistics database. There'll be recordings of these sessions and, of course, a link to the publication itself. As Jari Kappala mentioned in the opening of this Outlook launch day, the Outlook is meant to start a dialogue and it's a call for action. So thank you very much for your interest throughout these sessions. And please get in touch if you would like to speak more about our results or policy recommendations. I think all that remains to be said is have a good rest of your morning or afternoon or evening. Thank you very much and bye for now.